Now we will go over access compliance related portions of a given project. With regards to the general requirements associated with access compliance, the Education Code, of course, covers the responsibilities for project inspectors. We've already covered those earlier, but to briefly summarize again, the Education Code requires personal continuous inspection of all stages of construction work indicated as part of the scope of the work on the DSA approved construction documents. What we'll be going through during this presentation are going to be those commonly seen accessibility features and dimensional ranges that you would likely see on your project. With regards to some new amendments, those are indicated here in Chapter 11B, Section 206.2.19. This relates to pedestrian street crossings. Where walks or sidewalks are provided, a curb ramp, blended transition, or a combination of curb ramps and blended transitions complying with Section 11B-406 shall connect the walks or sidewalks at each pedestrian street crossing. Curb ramp, excluding any flared sides, or blended transition shall be contained wholly within the width of the pedestrian street crossing served. The exception: compliance with this section shall not be required where pedestrian crossing is prohibited by the appropriate administrative authority. Based upon information that was included in the initial statement of reasons associated with this code change, in the 2010 and prior editions of the CBC, the scoping was provided for curb ramps at street intersections. Unfortunately, DSA overlooked this section and did not bring it into the 2013 or 2016 codes. This code change that we now just looked at restores the scoping requirement for curb ramps at street intersections. Regarding this new amendment here, in relation to the means of egress in 11B-207.1, that needs to comply with Chapter 10, Section 1009. There are some exceptions to that. There's been no changes for items 1 and 2, in which when the means of egress are permitted by the local building or life safety codes to share a common path of egress travel. Accessible means of egress shall be permitted to share a common path of egress travel, and 2 areas of refuge shall not be required in detention and correctional facilities. Those exceptions are the same as what has been provided before, but this third one is new. The accessible means of egress are not required to be provided in existing buildings. This third exception was relocated in the IBC from 1009.1, Exception 1, to the IEBC 305.6. The IEBC is the International Existing Building Code. But DSA Access does not adopt that code, the IEBC. Therefore, the intent of that section needed to be relocated to this CBC section to ensure that the provision carries forward. Regarding this new amendment here, related to common use areas and common work areas, there's been further clarification that in 11B-248.1 common use areas, the common use areas shall comply with this chapter. Similarly, 11B-248.2 employee work areas, the employee work areas shall comply with this chapter. These sections now provide the explicit scoping for common use areas and employee work areas that must comply with the accessibility provisions covered in Chapter 11B. This was added to clarify confusion regarding whether access requirements applied to common use and employee work areas, even though 11B-201.1 indicates all areas shall comply with these requirements. Apparently there was a lack of understanding in that regard when it came to application of the code sections. These now explicitly note that with this modification. With regards to sign types and features that are covered in 11B-216, there's been no changes compared to the past code cycle. However, this schematic table, which identifies when they are required, is helpful and useful to be aware of. With regards to when tactile, visual, pictorial, a pictogram or a symbol is required based upon the nature of the sign, whether or not it's a designation type of sign, a direction or informational, an exit identification, and so on and so forth. Regarding accessible parking, there's really been no changes here compared to the past code in sections 11B-208 and 11B-502. Looking at this image here, which is showing common elements within accessible parking spaces, again, there's no changes from the past, and so we won't spend time dwelling on this image because it's the same requirements as has been required in the past. With regards to vertical clearance at parking space, there has been a bit of a change here for those vertical clearances in 11B-502.5. Parking spaces, access aisles, and vehicular routes serving them shall provide a clearance of 98 inches minimum. There is an exception now that's provided, and this is new. Here's the language. In existing multi-story parking facilities, car parking spaces, access aisles, and vehicular routes serving them shall provide a vertical clearance of 80 inches minimum rather than the 98 inches. Existing vertical clearances in excess of 80 inches and less than 98 inches shall be maintained. This exception shall not apply to van parking spaces, access aisles, or vehicular routes serving them. This vertical clearance in the existing multi-story parking facilities is often inadequate to provide strict compliance with the 11B-502.5 requirements and requires the building official to determine the existing condition is technically infeasible to allow accessible parking with a vertical clearance lower than 98 inches. The exception requires existing vertical clearances in excess of 80 inches and less than 98 inches to be maintained without reduction to provide the greatest vertical clearance possible in these existing facilities. The 80 inches minimum vertical clearance at car accessible parking spaces, access aisles, and vehicular routes serving them complies with the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. Regarding parking space identification signs, those are the same as they've been in the past in 11B-502.6. This requires the parking space identification signs at 80 inches above the finished floor or ground surface in the circulation paths, not just the accessible routes. Regarding electric vehicle charging stations, the definitions and scoping and technical aspects are still the same as what they were in the past code cycle. That's in Chapter 2, Section 202 has the definitions. Scoping, as far as what type and how many, that's covered in Chapter 11B, Section 11B-228.3. And regarding the technical aspects, as far as where they are located and how to make them accessible, that's still contained in Section 11B-812. This image here shows an electrical vehicle charging station example layout, and there's been no changes compared to the past cycle, so we will not dwell on this further. Regarding walking surfaces, 11B-403, for the running slope and cross slope, those are the same as before. When it comes to sidewalks, do not exceed the general grade established for adjacent street or highway. For walks, those are 5% or 1 in 20 max. Regarding cross slopes for sidewalks and walks, that's 2.083% or 1 in 48 maximum. These are the same as what they've been in the past code cycle. Regarding door and gate hardware, these provisions have not changed from what they were in the past. Regarding the operable parts specified in 11B-404.2.7, those must be usable with one hand and not require any tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist, and must be operable with less than 5 pounds of force to operate, so that means that they must not require more than 5 pounds to operate. And the operability with a closed fist is often a reliable test of the usability but not required by the code, and there's an image showing such a situation. With regards to treads and risers, most of it is the same as before, but there is some modifications here as outlined by the change with the text and the bullet styles identified. With regards to the riser, the upright part between two adjacent stair treads, this is a new definition part of it now. So that upright between two adjacent stair treads between either an upper or lower landing and an adjacent stair tread, or between two adjacent landings. And the definitions for step and tread are repealed to provide clarity for the requirement to provide handrails when only one riser is provided. For handrails at stairs and ramps in 11B-307.2 and 11B-505.5, there's been no changes here compared to the past code cycle. We still have the same protrusion limits at handrails of 4.5 inches max. The clearance dimensions are also the same as before, being at 1.5 inches minimum clear, required between the handrail gripping surface and the adjacent surfaces. And of course, as has been the case for quite some time, the gripping surface must not be obstructed on the top or the sides and must be continuous along their length. With regards to handrail orientation at stairs, it's the same as the last code cycle, which is covered in 11B-505.2.1, which requires at least one of the handrails must be continuous in the direction of travel, perpendicular to the stair nosing. In this image here, you can see that one of the rails complies with this, while the other one, due to a fanning out at the base of the stair, does go at an angle and is no longer perpendicular to the stair nosing. Because this does have at least one handrail in compliance, then it is okay. Regarding signage requirements, there's been no changes here compared to the previous code cycle. For 11B-703.4.1, the required signage location above the finished floor, the 48 inches minimum from the baseline of the lowest braille cell, as well as the 60 inches maximum from the baseline of the highest line of raised characters, is the same as it was in the previous code cycle. Similarly, for 11B-703.4.2, when it comes to the location of the signage, that needs to be located alongside the door at the latch side, as it has in the past. There still must be that 18 inches by 18 inches clear floor space being provided, and that's to be centered on the tactile characters. Regarding water closet locations in 11B-604.2, we have the same types of requirements that we had during the last code cycle. For a standard accessible stall, the center line is to be 17 inches minimum and 18 inches maximum from the adjacent side or side wall or partition. For those that are considered to be ambulatory accessible stalls, then the center line is to be 17 inches minimum and 19 inches maximum from the adjacent side wall or partition. For the water closet clearances, in section 11B-604.3.1, same requirements as before, and these have been around for quite some time. The clearance around the water closet shall be 60 inches minimum measured perpendicular from the side wall and 56 inches minimum measured perpendicular from the rear wall in individual user toilet rooms, and minimum 60 inches wide and 40 inches deep maneuvering space required in the front of the water closet. And the pictogram that you see on the right demonstrates this information pictorially. Grab bar cross sections in 11B-609.2 are the same as what they've been in the past code cycle. For those that have a circular cross section, the 1 1/4 inch minimum and 2 inch maximum outside diameter is still the case. When there are non-circular cross sections, there's the limitations that have been specified in the past code, that is the perimeter dimension of 4 inch minimum and 4.8 inches maximum, and the cross section dimension of 2 inch maximum still applies. For grab bar spacing and positions in 11B-609.3 and 609.4, the spacing and horizontal positions are the same as they've been in the past. For the spacing, that space between the wall and the grab bar still must be 1.5 inches absolute. However, at L or U-shaped grab bars, when those occur, the space between the walls and the grab bar may be 1.5 inches minimum for a distance of 6 inches on each side of the inside corner between two adjacent wall surfaces. That's for the situation if you have a single pipe going around the corner in those scenarios. Previously, with the code language for some code cycles ago, this was an area that led to lawsuits because this was an area that could not meet the 1.5 inches oftentimes. But this code section now recognizes that and has recognized it for some time. Regarding the horizontal position, there's a 33 inch minimum to 36 inch maximum above the finished floor measured to the top of the gripping surface and this has been what it is, the same as before.